My son put his hand against my chest outside a church in Ohio and told me I was embarrassing him, not because I was drunk, not because I'd started a fight. I was 60 years old, standing there in the only suit I owned, balancing on a cheap prosthetic leg, holding a small gift for my grandson's christening. Mark kept looking through the glass doors behind him, like he was terrified somebody might see us together. Then he leaned close and said, "Dad, I specifically told you not to come." I honestly thought I'd heard him wrong. I said, "I'm not trying to cause trouble. I just wanted to see the baby for 5 minutes." His face tightened. "Ashley's whole family is here. Her dad invited important people. We hired photographers. Please don't make this harder." I looked down at my old gray jacket, then at the metal and plastic under my left pant leg. "Make what harder?" He rubbed his forehead and whispered, "You know what I mean." I didn't answer. He grabbed my elbow harder than he needed to, turned me toward the sidewalk, and said, "Go home, Dad. You're embarrassing me." Then my own son walked back into that church and left me outside like some stranger who'd wandered in off the street. 28 years earlier, that same boy had been asleep against my chest when a doctor told me my wife wasn't coming home. Mark was 5. Linda got sick fast. 1 month, we were arguing about whether we could afford new kitchen cabinets, and a few months later, I was standing beside a hospital bed, wondering how the hell you explain death to a kindergartner. I wasn't some perfect single father. I burned dinner. I forgot picture day once. I sent Mark to school, wearing mismatched socks more times than I can remember. I worked as an industrial welder, so most nights I came home smelling like hot steel, sweat, and whatever chemical crap had gotten into my clothes that day. Sometimes I'd find him asleep on the couch, with a cartoon still playing, because he'd tried to wait up for me. I'd carry him to bed, then stand in his doorway for a minute, thinking, "Linda, I have no idea what I'm doing." But every morning, I got up and did it again. There wasn't anybody else. When overtime came up, I took it. Weekend shift? Mine. Somebody called out sick? Call Thomas. By the time Mark was in middle school, I was working so much that my hands sometimes cramped around the steering wheel on the drive home. Still, we had our little routines. Friday nights, if I wasn't working, we'd get a cheap pizza and watch whatever movie he picked. Sunday mornings, I'd make pancakes that always came out too dark around the edges. Mark would drown them in syrup and say, "They're getting better, Dad." They weren't. He was just being nice. As he got older, I started realizing the kid had a brain I never had. Math, writing, computers, business stuff, it all came easy to him. His teachers kept telling me he could go far. During his junior year, a guidance counselor sat me down and started talking about universities, scholarships, internships, and tuition numbers that made my stomach turn. On the drive home that afternoon, Mark stared out of the passenger window for 10 minutes before saying, "Dad, community college is fine." I knew exactly why he said it. He'd seen the bills on the kitchen counter. He knew what I made. I pulled my truck into an empty grocery store parking lot and shut off the engine. "Look at me," he did. "If you get into a good school, you're going." He started shaking his head. "Dad, it's stupid to spend that kind of money." I said, "Money is my problem. School is yours." He tried again. "You already work too much." That one hit me because he was right. I stared through the windshield for a second and said, "Your mom didn't get to watch you grow up. I did. I'm not going to spend all these years raising you just so you can shrink your life because you're worried about me." He got quiet after that. So did I. A month later, I picked up 3 extra night shifts every week. For years, my life was basically welding, coffee, 4 or 5 hours of sleep, and doing it again. When Mark graduated, I yelled his name so loudly that a woman 2 rows ahead turned around and glared at me. I didn't care. I had tears running down my face like an idiot. Mark found me afterward, still wearing his graduation gown, hugged me, and whispered, "We did it." I corrected him. "You did it." He pulled back and said, "No, we did." I remembered those words for years. Maybe that's why I ignored so many things later. You don't easily accept that the kid who once understood exactly what you sacrificed can grow into a man who's ashamed of the person who made those sacrifices. Things started changing after he met Ashley. Not all at once. Ashley was nice to me in the beginning, as she was smart, pretty, always put together, and came from money. Her father, Richard, was a successful real estate developer around Columbus. He knew doctors, attorneys, business owners, city people. The first dinner I had with her family was at a restaurant where I couldn't pronounce half the menu. I wore my gray suit and ordered steak because it was the only thing I completely understood. I didn't know it then, but that dinner was the first time I saw Mark look at me like I was something he needed to explain. Richard asked what I did for a living while we were waiting for dinner. I said, industrial welding. Been doing it most of my life. He nodded and said, good honest work. That should have been the end of it, but Mark jumped in immediately. Dad actually handles major industrial projects. He's basically a supervisor now. I turned and looked at him. I wasn't a supervisor. Sure, I'd trained younger guys and sometimes the foreman trusted me to keep an eye on things, but I still put on a hood and welded like everybody else. Richard didn't seem impressed or unimpressed. He just said, that's great, and changed the subject. On the drive home, I laughed and asked Mark, when did I get promoted? He kept his eyes on the road. I was just simplifying it. I said, you made it more complicated. He sighed. Dad, forget it. That little exchange bothered me for maybe 10 minutes. Then I let it go. I had spent my whole life wanting Mark to move into rooms where people wore expensive watches and talked about investments. I figured maybe he was just learning how to fit in. After Mark and Ashley got engaged, fitting in seemed to become his full-time job. He bought a nicer car before the old one was paid off. He started wearing suits that probably cost more than my first truck. Whenever I invited them over, there was always some reason they couldn't make it. Ashley had a work thing. Mark had dinner with a client. They were meeting her parents. I didn't take it personally at first. Young married couple, busy careers, different life. That's what I told myself. Then they found the house. Man, you should have seen Mark when he showed me the pictures. Stone front, huge windows, 3-car garage, kitchen bigger than my entire first apartment. Ashley loves it, he said. I asked him what it cost, and when he told me, I almost choked on my coffee. You can afford that? He smiled, but not quite naturally. Mostly, financing is the problem. Then he pulled a folder from his bag and placed it on my kitchen table. The bank wouldn't give him the arrangement he wanted on his own. His credit wasn't terrible, but he'd taken on debt, and his income wasn't enough to make the numbers look comfortable. My credit, on the other hand, was excellent. I'd spent decades paying everything on time. Mark explained that I could become the primary borrower and legal owner, while he made the monthly payments under an agreement between us. Later, after his promotion and a couple years of clean payments, he'd refinance and take everything over. I read the papers twice, though half the legal language might as well have been Chinese. So if you stop paying, I'm screwed? I asked. He laughed. I'm not going to stop paying. That's not what I asked. He leaned forward. Dad, come on, you know me. Yeah, I thought I did. Then he said something that finished the argument. This is where we're going to raise your grandkids someday. I signed my name. I even took out a separate loan to help with some of their initial expenses because Mark swore he'd repay that too. For a while, everything worked. Mark sent me the mortgage money, I paid the bank, and whenever I visited that house, I felt proud. I remember standing in their backyard one summer while Mark grilled burgers, and Ashley talked about putting a swing set near the fence when they had kids. I thought, this is why I worked all those nights. This right here. I didn't care that nobody at their parties knew the house was technically tied to me. I didn't need credit. I didn't need anybody thanking me. Seeing my son living better than I ever had was enough. Then, near the end of a major construction job, my entire life changed in about 3 seconds. We were working around heavy industrial equipment when something went wrong. I won't get graphic because I still don't like thinking about it. There was a mechanical failure, somebody yelled, and before I could move, my left leg was trapped. I remember the sound more than the pain, metal slamming, men shouting. Then this strange pressure, like my whole body had been hit by electricity. I woke up in the hospital after surgery with my mouth dry and my head floating from medication. A doctor came in, pulled a chair beside the bed, and started explaining tissue damage, blood flow, infection risk, everything they'd tried. I kept staring at the blanket. Finally, I said, "Just tell me." He paused and said, "They couldn't save the leg. Here's the part that messed with my head." I could still feel my foot. I swear to God, I could feel my toes curled under the blanket. I tried to move them. My brain told me they moved. Then I lifted the blanket and saw where my leg ended. I don't remember what I said. Probably nothing. I just stared. Mark came that evening. The second he walked through the door, his face collapsed. He sat beside me and grabbed my hand with both of his. "Dad, I'm here. Whatever you need, I'm here." For a minute, he looked like that little 5-year-old boy again. I squeezed his hand and tried to make a joke. "Takes more than this to get rid of your old man." He laughed, then wiped his eyes. I believed him when he said he'd be there. Why wouldn't I? For almost 30 years, Mark and I had been the two people who always showed up for each other. But after I got out of the hospital, showing up became complicated. I spent weeks in rehabilitation, learning things I'd never imagined having to learn at 60. How to stand without panicking, how to transfer my weight, how to get into a shower without falling, how to walk with a prosthetic leg that felt like somebody had strapped a piece of hardware to what was left of me and said, "Good luck." The first one I could afford wasn't anything fancy. It worked, technically, but after 20 minutes, the socket would start rubbing against my skin. After an hour, every step felt like sandpaper. The physical therapist kept telling me, "Thomas, don't rush it." I hated hearing that. I'd spent my entire adult life fixing problems with my hands. If something broke, you figured out why and repaired it. This was different. There was no repair that made me the man I'd been before that accident. Mark visited twice during the first month I was home. Ashley came once. She brought a casserole, stood in my living room for maybe 20 minutes, and kept checking her phone. I didn't blame her. She was pregnant by then, and everybody was excited about the baby. I was excited too. Hell, that baby became the thing I focused on whenever rehabilitation got bad. I'd tell myself, "Get walking, old man. You're going to have a grandson to chase around." But I started noticing that invitations disappeared. Before the accident, Mark would sometimes call and say, "We're grilling Saturday. Come over." Afterward, there was always a reason it wasn't a good weekend. Ashley was tired. They had guests. They were renovating something. Her parents were coming. One Saturday, I called Mark because I'd baked a ridiculous amount of food and asked if they wanted to stop by. He went quiet and said, "We've got people over tonight." I said, "No problem, another time." Then, before he hung up, I heard Ashley in the background asking, "Is that your dad?" Mark lowered his voice, but not enough. "Yeah." She said something I couldn't catch, and Mark answered, "I know, I'm handling it." A few weeks later, I understood what he was handling. Mark finally invited me to a backyard dinner because Richard and his wife were there. I arrived early so I wouldn't have to walk across the yard with everybody watching. Stupid, right? I was already adjusting myself for people who hadn't even said anything. During dinner, one of Ashley's friends asked about the prosthetic. She wasn't rude. She just said, "Does it hurt?" Before I could answer, Ashley jumped in. "He's doing great. It's temporary, until he gets something more advanced." I looked at her. Nobody had promised me anything more advanced. Later, when I was leaving, I heard two women talking near the kitchen. One said, "I felt so bad watching him walk." Ashley answered, "Yeah, it's awkward. Mark wants him included, obviously, but sometimes people don't know where to look." I stood in the hallway with my hand on the wall and felt my face getting hot. I waited until they moved away before I went outside. I didn't tell Mark I'd heard it. I just stopped asking to visit. Pride is a strange thing. You can lose half your leg and still be more afraid of somebody seeing that they've hurt you. So I kept going to physical therapy, collected my modest disability and retirement payments, and learned how to live inside a smaller life. Then the phantom pain started getting worse. If you've never had it, it's hard to explain without sounding insane. The leg wasn't there, but the pain absolutely was. Some nights, it felt like somebody was crushing a foot I no longer had. Other nights it burned. I'd sit on the edge of my bed at 2 in the morning, gripping the mattress, staring at empty space, waiting for my own brain to understand there was nothing there to hurt. My doctor tried different treatments. Some helped a little, others made me feel like a zombie. Eventually, he recommended a medication and treatment combination that wasn't fully covered under my plan. The immediate prescription I needed was around $150 out of pocket. That might not sound like much to some people, but that month I'd had repairs, utilities, and another payment connected to the money I'd borrowed helping Mark. My checking account was nearly empty. I stared at Mark's name on my phone for a long time before calling. Asking my son for money made my stomach twist. He'd asked me for thousands over the years, and I'd never made him feel ashamed about it. Still, I rehearsed the sentence before I pressed call. He answered after 4 rings. "Hey, Dad, what's up?" I could hear traffic and figured he was driving. I said, "Nothing big. I hate asking you this, but I'm a little short this month. Doctor gave me something for the nerve pain, and insurance isn't covering enough of it. Could you lend me $150 until my next payment comes in?" Silence. Then he exhaled. "Dad, seriously?" I thought maybe he hadn't heard me. "It's just a loan," he said. "Ashley and I have huge expenses right now. The baby's coming. The nursery, hospital stuff, everything. Every dollar is accounted for." I swallowed and said, "I understand. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't pretty bad." His voice changed then. Not angry, exactly. Irritated, like I was a bill collector. "Can't your doctor give you a free alternative?" I said we'd already tried cheaper options. He sighed again. "Dad, you have to stop assuming the most expensive solution is the only solution." That sentence sat there between us. I could hear his turn signal clicking through the phone. I said, "Mark, I'm not buying a television. I'm trying to sleep without feeling like somebody's drilling into a foot that isn't there," he answered. "I'm not saying you're making it up. I'm saying maybe you're exaggerating how bad it is because you're frustrated." I didn't speak for several seconds. Then I said, "Okay." He softened a little. "Look, after the baby comes, things will calm down. We'll figure something out." I almost reminded him that he was already 3 months behind on the money he was supposed to give me for the house. I almost reminded him that part of the reason I was broke was because his beautiful home still depended on my name, my credit, and my payments. But I didn't. I just said, "Take care of Ashley." Then I hung up, put the phone on the table, and sat there until the pain started again. That night was probably the first time I admitted to myself that something between Mark and me had actually broken. Not changed, broken. I stretched the medication I still had, taking less than the doctor told me to, because I couldn't afford another prescription yet. Some nights I slept 2 hours. Some nights I didn't sleep at all. And the stupid thing is, every time my phone buzzed, part of me still hoped it was Mark calling to say, "Hey, Dad, I thought about it. I'll bring the money over." He never did. 3 weeks later, though, he called me from the hospital, shouting, "Dad, he's here." I sat up so fast, I nearly knocked my prosthetic onto the floor. "The baby's okay?" I asked. Mark laughed. "He's perfect. 7 pounds, 9 ounces. Ashley's exhausted, but they're both good." I started crying before I even realized it. "What's his name?" I asked. "Ethan Thomas?" For a second I couldn't speak. "Thomas?" He said, "Yeah, Dad. After you." Whatever anger I'd been carrying softened right there. That's what family can do to you. Somebody hurts you, then says one thing that reaches straight into the part of you that still remembers who they used to be. I couldn't visit the hospital because Ashley wanted things quiet while she recovered. Mark promised they'd bring Ethan over soon. A week became 2. 2 became 4. Every time I asked, there was a reason. The baby wasn't sleeping. Ashley was overwhelmed. Her parents were helping. Then Mark told me the christening would be Sunday at a church near their neighborhood. I was standing in my kitchen when he mentioned it and immediately said, "What time?" There was a little pause. 11. I smiled even though he couldn't see me. Good, I'll be there early. He didn't answer right away. Mark? He cleared his throat. Yeah, we'll talk about it. I didn't understand what that meant, and honestly, I was too excited to care. I had almost nothing left that month, but I wanted to bring my grandson something from me. I found a good high chair online, more expensive than I should have bought, and stared at the price for 10 minutes before ordering it. It left me with barely enough for groceries and transportation, but I told myself I'd manage. I'd spent years going without for Mark. Doing it once for Ethan didn't feel like a sacrifice. Saturday evening, I pulled my gray suit from the closet. I brushed the jacket, ironed the shirt twice, polished my one dress shoe, then cleaned the visible part of my prosthetic. I know how that sounds. A 60-year-old man sitting alone at his kitchen table, polishing plastic and metal because he wanted to look respectable in pictures with his grandson. I even practiced standing in front of the mirror without leaning too hard on my cane. Around 7, somebody knocked. Mark was standing outside alone. No Ashley, no baby. He came in, but didn't take off his jacket. His eyes went straight to the suit hanging by the door, then to the gift box. "What's that?" he asked. "Something for Ethan." I smiled. "Don't worry, I didn't buy him a car." Mark didn't laugh. He walked into the living room and stayed standing while I sat down. That's when I knew something was wrong. You raise somebody long enough, you learn the signs. The way they avoid your eyes, the way they suddenly become interested in the carpet. I said, "Just say it." He rubbed his hands together. "Dad, Ashley and I were talking about tomorrow." I waited. He said, "Her parents have put a lot into this christening. Richard invited business people, friends, some local people he knows. There are going to be photographers. It's gotten bigger than we expected." I nodded. "Okay." Mark looked toward the window. "Ashley is stressed about everything looking right." I still refused to understand. "So?" He finally looked at me. "We think it might be better if you sit this one out." I actually laughed because it sounded too stupid to be real. "Sit out my grandson's christening?" Mark said. "We'll bring Ethan here next month. You can spend the whole day with him." My smile disappeared. Why would I sit it out? He opened his mouth, closed it, then said, "Dad, don't make me say this in a shitty way." Something cold moved through my stomach. "Say it however you need to say it." His eyes dropped toward my prosthetic for half a second. That was enough. "There are going to be a lot of pictures," he said. I looked at him. "And?" Mark rubbed his forehead. "You have trouble walking. Your suit is old. People ask questions. And then I have to explain everything, and Ashley already feels uncomfortable about—" He stopped. "About what?" I asked. "Come on, Dad." I leaned forward. "No." "Finish the sentence." He lowered his voice. "About how it looks." I stared at him. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. A car passed outside. I pointed toward my missing leg. "This?" He immediately said, "That's not what I mean." "Then what do you mean?" His voice got sharper. "Her family lives a certain way. People know them. I work with some of these people. I don't want everyone asking why my father shows up looking like he's struggling financially, or why you're walking around on some cheap medical prosthesis. It creates this whole story about me that isn't true." My hands tightened around the arms of the chair. "What story?" he snapped. "That I don't take care of my own father." The second those words left his mouth, Mark knew exactly what he'd done. His face changed, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. I nodded slowly. Well, wouldn't want anybody thinking that. He closed his eyes. Dad, that's not what I meant. I said, it sounded pretty clear to me. He said I was twisting his words and didn't understand the pressure he was under. I asked, what are you afraid they'll find out? That I lost my leg working? Or that I asked my son for $150 for pain medication and he said I was exaggerating? His face went red. That's low. I almost laughed. Low? He looked toward the door. This is exactly why I didn't want this conversation. I pointed at it. Then don't. Get out. He stood there a few seconds. We'll bring Ethan next month. I didn't answer. He left, and I heard his car pull away, while I sat staring at the high chair box in the corner. I barely slept. Around 6 Sunday morning, I got up, made coffee, and looked at the suit I'd prepared. I kept hearing Mark saying, it creates this whole story about me. Somewhere around 7, I decided I wasn't going to let him turn me into something shameful. I wasn't planning to cause a scene. I just wanted to see my grandson for 5 minutes, hand over the gift, then leave. I put on the suit, adjusted the prosthetic, and called a taxi because the bus stop was too far for me to walk comfortably. When the cab arrived, I checked my wallet. After the fare, I'd have less than $40 left. The driver, an older guy named Pete, saw me struggling and asked, need a hand? I said, no, thanks. I need to do it myself. Then we drove across town. The closer we got to the church, the more I wondered whether I should turn around. But every time I considered it, I pictured a baby named Ethan Thomas. The church parking lot looked like some kind of charity gala. Mercedes, BMWs, polished SUVs. Men in expensive suits stood near the entrance while women took pictures on the steps. I suddenly noticed every worn thread in my jacket. For a moment, I sat in the taxi and couldn't move. Pete looked at me in the mirror. This the place? I nodded. Yeah. Finally, I opened the door, planted my cane, and got out. Nobody stopped me or laughed. Nobody even seemed to notice me. I realized Mark's humiliation existed mostly inside his own head. I reached the foyer and saw Ashley near the sanctuary doors holding Ethan in a white christening gown. I'd only seen my grandson in pictures. He was tiny, one fist curled against her shoulder. For a second, everything else disappeared. Then Mark saw me. His smile vanished. He handed Ethan to Ashley and came straight across the foyer. What the hell are you doing here? He whispered. I said, keep your voice down. I'm not staying. He looked behind him toward Ashley's family. I told you not to come. And he's my grandson. Mark moved closer. Dad, please, not here. I lifted the gift bag. I just wanted to see him and give you this. I'll leave. He grabbed my elbow, hard. Come on, I pulled back. Don't grab me. A couple near the doors glanced toward us. Mark noticed them, and panic flashed across his face. He tightened his grip and pushed me toward the entrance. My prosthetic slipped half a step, and I caught myself with the cane. Mark, stop it, he hissed. Did you come here on purpose to ruin my life? I stared at him. What the hell are you talking about? He shoved the door open. Get out of here. You're embarrassing me. A few seconds later, I was outside. Through the glass, I watched Mark straighten his jacket before turning around. That detail did something to me. He didn't look back. He just fixed his jacket and walked toward his wife like he'd taken out the trash. I stood there holding the gift until my legs started aching, then made my way to a bench beside the church. Bells rang above me while guests kept arriving. One elderly woman asked if I needed help getting inside. I said, no, ma'am. I'm exactly where they want me. She looked confused and walked on. I expected tears or rage. Instead, something inside me went quiet. I thought about Linda and wondered what she'd say if she could see our son now. Then my mind started going backward through every excuse I'd made for him. The missed visits, the $150, the late payments, the way he'd rewritten my job at dinner, the way he'd made me feel ashamed of surviving an accident. Then I thought about the house. Mark hadn't sent me his full agreed payment in 3 months. First, the nursery had cost more than expected. Then there were medical bills. Then he promised he'd catch everything up after a bonus. But the bank didn't care about Mark's promises, because the bank wasn't dealing with Mark. It was dealing with me. My name was on the financing. I was the primary borrower and legal owner under the arrangement we'd created. Every shortage became my responsibility. I'd already covered part of it myself while he hosted dinners in a house he'd been telling people was his. I pulled out my phone and opened our messages. "I'll get you next month, Dad. Just cover it this time. Bonus is coming." 3 months of the same crap. And sitting on that bench, with church bells above me and pain running through a leg that wasn't there anymore, I finally understood something I'd spent years refusing to see. Mark wasn't embarrassed because I'd failed him. He was embarrassed because I was living proof of everything he'd taken from me. I sat on that bench for another 10 minutes, reading old messages. The more I scrolled, the worse it got. 6 months earlier, Mark had written, "Dad, I swear this is the last time I need you to cover part of the payment." 2 months later, it was, "Ashley doesn't need to know we're behind. Her pregnancy is stressful enough." Then, 3 weeks before the christening, "I'll catch everything up after my quarterly bonus." I had answered everyone the same way. "Okay. Don't worry. Take care of your family." I stared at those messages and suddenly felt stupid. Not generous, stupid. My son had spent years building an image of himself as a successful husband, living in a beautiful suburban home, and I was underneath that image, holding it up with what was left of my credit, savings, and income. Then, he had physically pushed me out of a church because he was afraid the people admiring that image might see me. I called the taxi company again. By some weird coincidence, Pete answered the pickup. When he pulled up, he looked toward the church and asked, "Finished already?" I opened the back door carefully. "Yeah, something like that." He asked where I was going. I almost gave him my home address. The words were right there. Instead, I said, "Can you take me downtown?" He glanced at the clock. "Sure. Where?" I gave him the address of the bank branch that had handled the house financing. During the ride, I called the number on an old business card I still had in my wallet. A woman named Karen had helped with some of the original paperwork. I expected voicemail, but she answered. I said, "Karen, this is Thomas Miller. You helped me with a property a few years back." She remembered me after a moment. I explained that the payments from the person occupying the property had stopped, and I needed to know exactly what rights I had. She said the branch had limited Sunday service and told me to come in. I want to be clear about something, because Mark later told everybody I lost my mind outside that church and sold his home in some emotional fit. That's not what happened. I didn't walk into a bank, slam my fist down, and scream, "Sell the house." Real life doesn't work like that. I spent hours asking questions. Karen pulled the records. Another employee reviewed the title structure and the documents connected to our arrangement. My name wasn't there as some meaningless favor. I was the primary borrower and legal owner. Mark had been occupying the property and paying through me under the agreement we'd made. The missed payments had created a real financial problem for me. I asked Karen twice, "If I want out, can I sell?" She said, "You need an attorney to review everything before you make that decision. But based on what I'm seeing, you appear to have that authority." I asked for copies of every relevant document. By then, my phone had started buzzing. "Mark." I let it ring. A minute later, he called again. Then came a message. "Where are you?" I almost laughed at that. He'd thrown me out and now wanted to know where I'd gone. Another message appeared. "Dad, don't do anything stupid. We'll talk after the christening." I read it 3 times. Don't do anything stupid. Like he somehow knew the old version of me had disappeared on that bench. I turned the phone face down. Karen noticed and asked, "Everything okay?" I said, "No, but I think it finally will be." She gave me the number of a real estate attorney who'd worked with the bank before. I called him from the lobby. His name was Daniel Reeves. I expected him to tell me to call Monday. Instead, after I explained the situation, he asked me to email photographs of the documents and said he'd review them that afternoon. I went home and waited. The high chair was still sitting by the wall. I took off my jacket, loosened the prosthetic, and sat at the kitchen table with every piece of paperwork I could find spread in front of me. Around 4, Daniel called back. He spoke slowly and kept warning me not to make decisions based on anger. I appreciated that. Then he confirmed what mattered. Mark didn't own the house. I did. The agreement between us documented his responsibility to provide the money for the payments and other costs, and his repeated failure to do so gave me a legitimate reason to end the arrangement. Daniel said, "Thomas, you can sell the property, but you need to understand the consequences. Your son and his family are living there." I looked at the empty chair across from me. "I understand." He asked, "Are you sure?" I thought about Mark grabbing my arm. I thought about him saying my prosthetic created questions about his status. "Not yet," I said, "but I'm getting there." Monday morning, I was at Daniel's office before 9. We went through everything again. No shortcuts. No fantasy revenge crap. I wanted it legal. I wanted every signature correct because I knew Mark would fight the second he understood what was happening. Daniel contacted a real estate agent who specialized in fast sales and investor purchases. The agent warned me I'd get less than market value if speed mattered. I said speed mattered. By afternoon, we had interest from an investment company that bought houses and converted them into rental properties. Their offer was lower than I could have gotten by listing normally, but after the mortgage balance, fees, and debts were handled, I would still walk away with enough money to change my life. Before I signed anything final, I called Mark once. He answered immediately. "Dad, finally. Look, yesterday got out of hand." I said, "You're 3 months behind." Silence. Then, "What?" "The house payments. 3 months." His tone changed. "Seriously? That's what this is about?" I said, "I'm asking when you're paying me." He groaned. "I told you. My bonus. Ashley just had a baby. We had the christening. Do you have any idea what that cost?" I stared at Daniel across the desk. "No, Mark." "How much did the photographers cost?" He went quiet. I continued. "More than $150? He said, "Oh my God. You're still stuck on that?" That was the answer I needed. I said, "Okay, take care of your family." He replied, "Dad, wait." I hung up. Daniel looked at me for a long moment and asked one final time if I understood what signing the sale documents meant. My hand was steady when I picked up the pen. For years, I'd signed papers to help Mark move forward. College forms, loan documents, mortgage papers. Every signature had been about giving him something. This one was different. I signed my name because for the first time in almost 30 years, I was done sacrificing my own life to protect his. Tuesday morning, Mark called me at 7:12. I know the exact time because I was awake, sitting at my kitchen table with coffee, when his name lit up my phone. I answered, and before I could say hello, he shouted, "What the hell did you do?" I held the phone away from my ear. "Good morning to you too." He said, "There is a notice on my door saying the property was sold. Tell me this is some kind of mistake." I took a sip of coffee. My hand was shaking, but I wasn't going to let him hear it in my voice. "It's not a mistake." There was silence. Then Ashley started yelling somewhere behind him. Mark said, "You sold our house?" I corrected him. "I sold my house." That made him explode. "Are you insane? We live here. Your grandson lives here." I closed my eyes. There it was, my grandson. Suddenly, Ethan mattered as leverage. I said, "You were supposed to make the payments. You stopped." Mark yelled, "For 3 months. 3 damn months, Dad. I told you I'd catch up." I said, "And I spent 3 months covering for you while you told everybody this place belonged to you." He started talking so fast, I could barely follow him. He said the sale couldn't be legal, that he'd sue me, that Ashley's father knew attorneys who would destroy the deal. I let him finish. Then I said, "Call whoever you want. My attorney has the paperwork." Mark went quiet for half a second. "Your attorney?" He sounded genuinely shocked, like the idea that I could hire one had never crossed his mind. Yes. Then he read part of the notice out loud. The investment company had purchased the property and was offering the occupants a choice under the legal process their lawyers had prepared: comply with the required move-out terms or discuss a new lease at current market pricing. The proposed rent was almost twice what Mark had effectively been paying before. He said, "We can't afford this," I answered. "Then I guess you couldn't afford the house." He called me a bitter old bastard. I almost fired something back, but I stopped. "Mark, Sunday you pushed me out of a church because you were ashamed. People might discover you don't take care of your father. Now you're angry because the thing I was providing for you is gone. Think about that." He hung up. I figured the worst part would be Mark's anger. I was wrong. Around noon, Richard called. I'd never spoken to Ashley's father on the phone without Mark or Ashley being involved, so seeing his name surprised me. His voice was controlled. "Thomas, I need to understand what's happening." I said, "What did Mark tell you?" Richard paused. "He says you sold their home after an argument at the christening." I said, "Did he tell you whose home it legally was?" Another pause. "He said you co-signed." I laughed once. "That's not the arrangement." I explained it. Not every detail, just enough. My credit, my name, the payments Mark was supposed to provide, the 3 months he'd fallen behind. Richard became very quiet. Then he asked, "How much money did you contribute when they bought it?" I told him. He asked about the additional loan. I told him that too. Finally, he said, "Thomas, I was under the impression Mark purchased that house himself." That sentence told me more than Richard probably realized. Mark hadn't just let people assume he was successful. He had built a whole story. Richard asked if he could see the documents. I told him my attorney could provide whatever was appropriate. Then he surprised me. "What happened at the church?" I almost said it didn't matter. Instead, I told him exactly what happened, including Mark coming to my house the night before. I repeated the part about the photographers, my old suit, my prosthetic, and the questions my appearance might raise about Mark's status. Richard didn't interrupt once. When I finished, he said, "He said that to you?" I answered, "Pretty much word for word." Richard breathed out slowly. "I saw him take you toward the entrance. He told us you weren't feeling well." I stared at the wall. Of course he did. Even while throwing me out, Mark had protected the image. Ashley called that evening. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her. "How could you do this with a newborn in the house?" she asked. I said, "Ashley, I'm sorry Ethan is caught in this. I mean that." She said, "Then undo it." I told her I couldn't simply pretend the sale hadn't happened. She called me cruel. Then she said, "Mark told me the house was basically his, and your name was only there because of some technical issue." I said, "That's not true." She stopped crying for a second. I explained the missed payments and the money I'd put into the house. Then I told her something I hadn't planned to mention. When I needed $150 for medication after losing my leg, Mark told me every dollar was accounted for. She didn't say anything. I continued. 3 weeks later, he spent money on a christening where I wasn't welcome because my prosthetic looked bad in photographs. I hated saying it out loud. Somehow, hearing the whole thing in my own voice made it sound even worse than it had felt while it was happening. I heard her breathing on the other end. Finally, she said, "He told me you decided not to come because the pain was bad." I leaned back in my chair. Another lie. Then Ashley whispered, "He said you didn't want people seeing you like that." I felt something inside me sink, even though I thought there was nothing left to sink. Mark hadn't only excluded me, he'd made it sound like I was ashamed of myself. I said, "Ashley, I cleaned my prosthetic Saturday night because I wanted to look good in pictures with Ethan. Your husband came to my house and told me to stay home." She started crying again, but differently this time, quieter. I didn't enjoy it. I didn't feel victorious. This was my grandson's mother, realizing her marriage might not be what she thought it was. Ashley didn't say much after that, She asked me to send her copies of anything showing how the house had actually been financed. I told her to speak with Daniel because I didn't want Mark accusing me of manipulating documents. Before hanging up, she asked one question. Thomas, did my parents ever make you feel unwelcome because of your leg? I thought about Richard, helping move a chair for me at that backyard dinner. I thought about her mother asking whether physical therapy was going well. No, I said, not once. Ashley whispered, okay, and ended the call. About an hour later, Mark started calling again. I ignored the first 4 calls. On the 5th, I answered. He didn't even say hello. What did you tell Ashley? I said, the truth. He shouted, you're trying to destroy my marriage now? I pulled the phone away from my ear. I didn't call your wife, she called me. He said, you had no right to discuss our finances with her. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They're her finances too, Mark. She lives in the damn house. He started blaming me for everything. The mortgage arrangement had been my idea. I'd pressured him into buying instead of renting. I'd always used money to control him. Every sacrifice I'd made was suddenly some kind of weapon I'd been secretly storing for 30 years. I listened until he said, you've always resented that I became more successful than you. That one almost made me laugh. Mark, I worked 2 shifts so you could become more successful than me. That was the whole point. He went quiet. I continued. I wanted you to have the degree, the career, the house, all of it, but somewhere along the way, you decided having more than me meant you had to pretend you came from more than me. He said, you don't understand my world. I looked down at the socket of my prosthetic. No. Apparently in your world, a man can pay for your education, help put a roof over your head, lose a leg working, and still be too embarrassing to stand beside you in a photograph. He hung up again. Over the next 2 weeks, things moved faster than I expected. Richard met with Daniel and saw enough documentation to understand that Mark had lied about the house. Then Ashley started looking through their accounts. That's when she discovered the problem was bigger than 3 missed payments. Mark had credit card debt she'd never known about. He'd been spending money keeping up appearances, expensive dinners, clothes, memberships, things he apparently considered necessary for his career. Some of the money he'd told Ashley was going toward the house hadn't gone there at all. Richard called me afterward and sounded exhausted. I owe you an apology, he said. I asked what for. For believing the version of himself Mark sold us. I said, you don't owe me anything. I believed it longer than you did. He was silent, then said, for what it's worth, Thomas, nobody at that christening would have cared about your prosthetic. I closed my eyes. I know that now. Ashley took Ethan and moved back into her parents' home before the deadline on the property expired. Mark refused to go with her. From what Richard later told me, Mark accused her family of turning against him because he'd lost the house. Ashley told him the house wasn't the reason she was leaving. The lies were. She'd spent years believing they were financially secure because Mark kept telling her promotions and bonuses were covering everything. Now she was discovering that his father, the welder he was too embarrassed to photograph, had been quietly holding their life together. A few days later, Mark showed up at my house. I saw him through the front window and almost didn't open the door. He knocked again. Dad, I know you're in there. I opened it, but didn't invite him inside. He looked terrible. Wrinkled shirt, dark circles under his eyes, beard coming in unevenly. I'd never seen him like that. Ashley left, he said. I nodded. I heard. His eyes filled immediately. She's taking Ethan from me, I said. She's staying with her parents. That's not the same thing. He stepped closer. You happy now? I stared at him. No. He shook his head. Bullshit. This is what you wanted. I said, what I wanted was to attend my grandson's christening. His face twisted. So because I asked you to skip one event, you destroyed my entire life? I felt my jaw tighten. You didn't ask me to skip an event. You told me my body, my clothes, and my existence made you look unsuccessful. Then you grabbed me and pushed me outside. He said, I was stressed, I answered, and I was your father. For a second, neither of us moved. Then Mark started crying, not quietly. He covered his face and said, I screwed up, okay? Is that what you want to hear? I screwed up. Seeing him like that hurt more than I expected. Every instinct I'd built as his father told me to pull him inside, make coffee, tell him we'd fix it. That's what I'd always done. Fix it. Pay it. Cover it. Forgive it. I gripped the door frame instead. Mark lowered his hands. Talk to Ashley. Tell her this got blown out of proportion. Tell Richard I'm not some loser. I stared at him and realized he still didn't understand. Even now, he wanted me to repair his image. I said, no. He blinked. What? I'm not calling anybody. His expression hardened almost instantly. So that's it? You're abandoning me? I shook my head. Mark, you're 33 years old. Your wife left because you lied to her. Your housing situation collapsed because you stopped making payments. Those aren't things I did to you. He pointed at my chest. You sold the house, I said. Yes, the house I was legally responsible for while you were 3 months behind. He shouted, I'm your son, I answered. And I'm your father. That didn't seem to mean much when you were pushing me through a church door. He stared at me with a look I still can't forget. There was anger in it, but underneath the anger was fear. For the first time, Mark understood I wasn't going to rescue him. He stepped backward and said, You're going to regret this. I wanted to tell him I already regretted 1,000 things. Instead, I said, I hope you figure yourself out. Then I closed the door. My hand started shaking the second the lock clicked. I leaned against the wall and stayed there until I heard his car leave. I didn't feel powerful. I felt sick, but I also knew that if I'd opened that door again, handed him money, called Ashley, or tried to fix his marriage, we'd be right back where we'd started. Mark didn't need another rescue. He needed to finally discover what happened when nobody else paid the price for his choices. The sale closed a little over 3 weeks later. After the mortgage, fees, taxes, and the remaining debt connected to the property were handled, I had more money sitting in my account than I'd ever had at one time in my life. I wish I could tell you I looked at that number and felt like I'd won. I didn't. I sat in the bank parking lot for almost an hour, thinking about the first day Mark showed me that house. I remembered him standing in the empty kitchen saying, Imagine Thanksgiving here, Dad. I remembered Ashley pointing through the back window and talking about a swing set for children they didn't even have yet. I remembered signing those papers because I thought I was helping build something that would outlive me. Now strangers owned the place. Ashley was living with her parents, and my son wouldn't speak to me unless he was calling to blame me for all of it. I kept asking myself whether I'd gone too far. Sometimes the answer was yes. 5 minutes later, I'd remember him pushing me through those church doors, and I wasn't sure anymore. Daniel told me something during our last meeting that stuck with me. He said, Thomas, don't make your next decision about your son. Make it about you. That sounded almost ridiculous, because I couldn't remember the last time I'd made a major decision that wasn't somehow about Mark. Even after losing my leg, I'd worried about whether my accident would interfere with his life. So I started small. I went back to my doctor and told him I wanted to seriously address the phantom pain instead of just surviving it. We discussed specialists, different medications, physical therapy, and a better prosthetic setup. Some of it wasn't cheap. For once, I didn't immediately calculate what Mark might need next month. I paid for the treatment. The first night I slept almost 6 uninterrupted hours. I woke up confused because sunlight was coming through the curtains. I lay there for a while, waiting for the pain to hit. It was still there, but quieter. I actually laughed. 6 hours of sleep felt like somebody had handed me my life back. A month later, I started thinking about leaving Ohio. There wasn't much keeping me there anymore besides memories, most of which had become painful. A guy I'd worked with years ago had retired near Florida's Gulf Coast and kept telling me, "Tom, winters down here won't beat the hell out of that leg." I started looking online as a joke. Then I found a small, one-story place about 20 minutes from the water. Nothing fancy. 2 bedrooms, a little screened porch, enough yard for a grill. More importantly, no stairs. I flew down to see it, walked through the rooms, and could immediately picture myself there. The real estate agent kept pointing out features while I stood on the porch listening to birds and thinking about how quiet it was. She asked, "Want some time to think?" I surprised both of us by saying, "No, let's do it." I didn't tell Mark before I moved. There was no dramatic reason. We simply weren't talking. Ashley, however, called me a few times. She never asked me for money. Mostly she gave me updates about Ethan. The first time she sent a video of him laughing, I watched it about 20 times. I asked if she was comfortable with me staying in his life. She said, "Thomas, whatever happened between you and Mark, you're Ethan's grandfather." I had to put the phone down for a second after that. I told her I would never involve Ethan in our conflict or speak badly about Mark to him. She said, "I appreciate that." Then she told me she'd filed for divorce. I didn't ask for details, but she said the financial lies had been going on longer than she realized. She couldn't trust him anymore. That word kept coming up. Trust, not the house, not the christening, trust. Mark eventually rented a room in a house on the outskirts of Columbus. Richard told me that, not because I asked, but because he thought I should know Mark was alive and working. Between child support, attorney fees, debt payments, and ordinary expenses, Mark's comfortable lifestyle disappeared fast. He sold the expensive car. He stopped going to the clubs and restaurants he'd once considered necessary for networking. Some of the people he'd been so desperate to impress vanished from his life almost immediately. That part didn't surprise me. What surprised me was how little satisfaction I felt hearing it. I'd imagined that if Mark ever experienced consequences, something in me would feel balanced. Instead, I kept seeing him at 5 years old, asleep on my chest after Linda died. You don't erase 30 years of loving somebody because they've become someone you don't recognize. 6 months after the christening, I was sitting on my screened porch in Florida when Mark finally wrote to me. Not called, wrote. It was a long email, probably the longest thing he'd sent me since college. The first line was, "I hope you're happy." I almost closed it, then I kept reading. He said I'd acted like a psychopath because my ego had been wounded at the church. He said I'd destroyed my own son's family over one humiliating argument. According to him, Ethan would now grow up in a broken home because his grandfather needed revenge. He wrote, "You could have taught me a lesson without taking everything from me." I stopped there and read that sentence again, taking everything from me. Even after 6 months, Mark still believed everything he'd lost had belonged to him automatically. Then I reached the last paragraph. His tone changed. He wrote, "I don't know who I can trust anymore. Ashley hates me. Richard thinks I'm a fraud. Half the people I thought were friends stopped calling. I go to work, come back to this room, and there's nobody here. Maybe that's what you wanted." I put my phone down and stared across the yard. That sentence hurt, not because he was right, because I knew exactly what loneliness felt like. I'd lived through Linda's death. I'd eaten dinner alone for years. I'd sat in a hospital bed, staring at the place where my leg used to be. I wouldn't wish that emptiness on my son. But I also couldn't keep protecting him from every consequence, just because watching him suffer hurt me. I opened a reply and typed, "Mark, I never wanted you alone." Then I deleted it because it sounded too simple. I tried again. "I haven't stopped loving you. I don't think I ever could." I left that part. Then I wrote, "But loving you doesn't mean financing your lies, accepting your disrespect, or pretending what happened at that church was just one bad moment. It was the moment I finally saw what years of rescuing you had helped you become." I stared at those words for a long time before continuing. There was one thing I needed him to understand. even if it took another 30 years. I finished the email with the one thing I needed Mark to understand. The worst punishment for greed isn't losing money. It's ending up alone because you've used and lied to so many people that nobody knows when they can trust you anymore. You lied to Ashley about the house. You let her parents believe you bought it yourself. You spent money you didn't have because you wanted successful people to think you were one of them. And when I showed up at Ethan's christening, you weren't worried about me causing trouble. You were worried somebody might see your father with an old suit and a prosthetic leg and realize where you actually came from. I stopped for a moment, then continued. I didn't sell the house because you're my enemy. You're my son, Mark. I still love you. But for years, every time you made a bad financial decision, I protected you from the consequences. I paid, I signed, I covered for you. When you fell behind, I gave you more time. When you lied, I looked the other way because I didn't want to lose you. All that did was teach you that Dad would always fix it. I'm not doing that anymore. I told him that if he ever genuinely wanted to rebuild our relationship, he could call me. But I also made the boundaries clear. I won't buy you another house. I won't pay your debts. I won't lie to Ashley. I won't call Richard and repair your reputation. And I will never again apologize for being a welder, wearing inexpensive clothes, or walking on a prosthetic leg. I worked for everything I had. I worked 2 shifts so you could get an education and live better than I did. I was proud that you became successful. What I didn't realize was that eventually you became ashamed of the man who helped you get there. Then I wrote, I hope someday you'll learn to judge people by what they do, not by their clothes, their house, their job title, their bank account, or the way they walk. Maybe then you'll understand what happened between us. I pressed send. Mark didn't answer for almost 2 weeks. Then one night I received 4 words. I read it, Dad. Nothing else. No apology. No accusation either. I didn't respond. Over the next few months, I focused on rebuilding my own life. The money left from the sale allowed me to move into a small 1-story home in Florida. It wasn't luxurious, and I didn't want luxurious. I wanted something I could afford without debt and move around in comfortably. More importantly, I finally paid for better treatment for the phantom pain and a higher quality prosthetic. The difference was huge. I could sleep through most nights again. I could walk farther without stopping. For the first time since the accident, my life wasn't organized around pain. Mark's life went in the opposite direction. Ashley continued with the divorce. Once she discovered the hidden debts and learned how much of their lifestyle had depended on my credit and money, she said she couldn't trust him anymore. Mark moved into a rented room outside Columbus. The expensive car disappeared. Between child support, attorney fees, debt payments, and normal expenses, a large part of his salary was gone before he could spend it. The people he'd worked so hard to impress weren't around much anymore. I didn't celebrate any of that. He was still my son. Ashley kept me involved with Ethan. She sent pictures and videos and eventually started video calling me so I could see him. I made one promise to her. Ethan would never hear me insult his father. Whatever Mark had done to me, I wasn't going to make a child carry it. Then, about 6 months after the christening, Mark called. I almost didn't answer. Hey, Dad. Hey. We talked awkwardly for a few minutes. Work, Florida, Ethan. Nothing important. I kept waiting for him to ask for money. He didn't. Finally, he said, Dad? Yeah? He went quiet. Then he said, I shouldn't have pushed you out of the church. I didn't rescue him from the silence. No, I said. You shouldn't have. I know. Another pause. Then he said, I was embarrassed. I know that too. He corrected himself. No, I was embarrassed about the wrong person. That one got me. Mark said he'd spent so much time trying to impress Ashley's family and people at work that he'd started seeing everything through their imagined judgment. The house had to be right. The car had to be right. His clothes had to be right. His family had to look right. And then you showed up, he said. I waited, and I saw the prosthetic, the old suit, and all I could think about was what people might assume about me. I said, "Nobody cared, Mark." "I know. Richard didn't care." "I know. Ashley didn't ask me to leave." Silence. Then Mark said, "I know." That was the first time I felt like he actually understood what he'd done. I didn't forgive everything during that call. I didn't offer him money. I didn't promise to fix his marriage. We talked for maybe 10 minutes more and hung up. We're still not completely okay. Maybe we won't be for a long time. But Mark calls occasionally now, and he hasn't asked me for $1. He's working, paying what he owes, seeing Ethan, and dealing with the consequences of his choices himself. And that's enough for now. People can say I went too far by selling the house. Maybe some of you believe I did. Mark certainly believed that for a long time. But here's what I know. If I'd forgiven him immediately after that christening, covered another mortgage payment, and continued financing his life, nothing would have changed. He would have learned that he could humiliate his own father and still expect that father to pay his bills the next morning. I spent most of my life teaching my son that I'd always catch him when he fell. Eventually, I realized I'd forgotten to teach him something just as important. A grown man sometimes needs to hit the ground and learn how to stand back up himself. I still love my son. I hope his marriage ending wasn't the end of his family. I hope he becomes the father Ethan deserves. And I hope someday he understands that losing the house wasn't the worst thing that happened to him. The worst thing was becoming the kind of man who looked at his own father outside a church and saw an embarrassment instead of the man who raised him. So tell me what you think. Did I go too far by selling the house? Or did Mark finally face consequences he had avoided for years? And if your own son pushed you out of your grandson's christening because he was ashamed of your disability, what would you have done? If this story stayed with you, support the channel with a like and tell me your opinion in the comments.